We're now only a few days away from the first European race weekend of the year as F1 moves from the sunny streets of Miami onto Imola for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, which means it is time for my preview and predictions. This is a series where I'll be previewing, and then at the end of the video I'll be giving out my top 5 early predictions for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. Currently the majority of viewers are not subscribed, and if you're one of those, I would greatly appreciate it if you just tapped that little sub button. Now, let's get into the video. As mentioned, F1 is back in Europe, with Imola as the calendar descends into the European part of the season, and this is where we typically start to see teams bring some major upgrades and changes to their car, as the teams continue to try and find a way to close the gap to the mighty Red Bull team, who are now 5 wins out of 5 Grand Prix so far this year, and Max Verstappen took an incredible victory despite starting down in 9th place, while Sergio Perez finished in 2nd after a pole position. And speaking of Red Bull, I will be talking more about Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari and Aston Martin a little bit later on, so stick around for that. Right now though, what about Imola? Well, as I mentioned, Imola is the first European round of the season, and that means major upgrades are going to be coming to some of the cars, which has a potential for shaking up the order. Adding to the potential shaking up of the order is the current weather around Imola. The entire Emilia-Romagna section of Italy have been really struggling with dreadful amounts of rain and flooding in recent weeks, and the forecast, at least as of right now, sees this band of heavy rain continuing, meaning that we could very well see the intermediates and full wets being used a lot during this weekend. Pirelli will be taking a new spec of full wet tyre, and it will be interesting to see if this full wet tyre allows the drivers to compete finally in heavier rain than the previous spec of wets could actually do. But a wet race could lead to more overtakes and more mistakes. However, that being said, last year's race was also wet, but there was not too much overtaking, as in 2022 there was a grand total of 23 on-track overtakes, with the majority of those overtakes happening in the wet portion of the Grand Prix. Speaking of the tyres, should the race be dry, then the drivers will have the C3, C4 and C5 compound of tyres to use, which is a step softer than what Pirelli brought to the race last year. This could really change the face of the race, as we may just see some additional pit stops, as last year there was only 25 pit stops, and that probably would have been 20 pit stops if it was a normal dry race. Although that being said, due to the pit lane time loss, I will be surprised if we see anything other than a straightforward one stop, with the teams going from the medium tyres to the hard compound, which should take them to the end of the race. Overtaking at Imola is not easy. The circuit has been notorious throughout the decades with being tricky to pass on, and with, as of right now, only one DRS zone down the pit straight, then we may see that once again overtakes will be tricky. I will be intrigued though to see if the FIA opt to potentially increase the length of that DRS zone, so that we could potentially see a little bit more going on with on-track overtakes, with the cars being able to go side by side into the Tamburello chicane. Although we have seen in the past some brave overtakes into corners such as Tosa, Piratella and the Variante Alta chicane, but these normally require big commitment and a big tyre difference. This means that qualifying is all important, and last year in qualifying the pole position lap time was a 1:27.999 by Max Verstappen in the Red Bull, but that was under wet conditions. This can be seen by the fact that the fastest lap in the race was a 1:18.446, also by Max Verstappen in the Red Bull car. Provided that the weekend is dry, then I imagine that the qualifying lap will almost certainly be faster than what Max achieved last year. Speaking of Max Verstappen, it is now time to take a look at the top 4 teams in the Constructors' Championship, and let's start with the team that is 4th in the Constructors, and that is Ferrari. For Ferrari, Miami was a massive step backwards from what was a great Azerbaijan Grand Prix just the week before. Charles Leclerc threw away a potential P2 on the grid when he made a mistake on his qualifying lap, which you can see when comparing the gap from Alonso to Leclerc. And then of course Leclerc proceeded to crash on his second lap, which ended his qualifying. In the race itself, Leclerc spent a lot of time stuck behind the Haas car of Kevin Magnussen, And then in the dying stages of the race, Leclerc was overtaken by Lewis Hamilton. His teammate Carlos Sainz, however, did fare a little bit better, at least until he put on the hard compound of tyres. On mediums, Sainz was just as fast, if not a little bit faster than the Aston Martin of Fernando Alonso, but on the hard tyres, Sainz struggled and was on track overtaken by the Mercedes of George Russell. For Ferrari, they really need to get on top of a balance issue that they have whenever they put on a set of harder compound of tyres. With Imola having the softest possible compounds, similar to what we saw in Baku, we could maybe see a slightly better performance from the team if it is a fully dry race, because they don't have to worry about a set of hard tyres maybe being a little bit too hard like we have seen them have in previous races. But they also need to make sure they don't lose out on the development race, as it's not too clear yet what upgrades Ferrari are going to be bringing to Imola. Next up is Mercedes. On the face of it, the Miami race was a tale of two halves for the team. Qualifying was not particularly excellent for Mercedes, especially with Lewis Hamilton going out in Q2 on pace alone. However, in the race itself, Mercedes were much stronger and were faster than the Ferrari team, and they managed to score some strong, valuable points. But it was that one lap pace where they fell down. Mercedes cannot afford for Imola to be similar to Miami, because overtaking, as Lewis Hamilton found out at last year's race in Imola, can be very, very difficult. However, thankfully for Mercedes, they are planning on bringing some upgrades to increase the performance of the W14. This includes updates to the suspension, some bodywork, and the floor, although it's not too clear yet if there's going to be any major changes to the side pods. This may not be enough to mean that they can now fight the Red Bulls, but it may bring them back into the contention to more consistently fight with the likes of Ferrari, and more importantly for Mercedes, the Aston Martin team. For Aston Martin, at least for Fernando Alonso, Miami was a return to form, as Fernando was back on the podium after being absent from it in Baku. And for Aston Martin, Miami was a great step forward in terms of pace and performance. It was the first weekend where we got to see Aston Martin upgrades come to fruition, as they had the same level of DRS efficiency as Red Bull, as this graph shows. Also, along with this and improved straight line performance, Aston Martin are edging themselves closer and closer to the Red Bull team. They are still a long way away, but with improved straight line performance, both with and without the DRS, they can build on what is already a great car in terms of downforce, which we have seen at previous races. With Imola being a track that lends itself to a stable car with good downforce, Aston Martin could be poised to have another great weekend. And with both Alonso and Lance Stroll being very handy in the wet, and there is a good potential of rain this weekend, there is a good chance that Aston Martin could potentially finish at least one step higher on the podium than they have managed so far this season. I have a good feeling that they could very well distance themselves from the cars around them and find themselves starting to hunt down the two Red Bulls a little bit. At least that is, of course, with Fernando Alonso. Hopefully for Lance Stroll, he can have a better weekend, because of course Miami was not a great weekend for Stroll. All he needs to do is make sure that he can be in the fight with Mercedes and Ferrari and potentially play rear gunner for Fernando Alonso, especially if Alonso can get ahead of one of the Red Bull cars, or maybe even both Stroll and Alonso can get ahead of one of the Red Bull cars. Finally, for Red Bull, Miami was another masterclass performance by the team. Max Verstappen, despite starting down in P9 on the grid, was able to fight his way through the field and not only beat all the competition, but he was also able to beat his teammate Sergio Perez, despite the fact Perez started on pole position and spent the vast majority of the race in front on his own with no cars around him. This was down to Max being very good on the tyres and maintaining pace despite the hard tyres being over 40 laps old, as this comparison shows between the two drivers. This incredible pace by Max was helped by him being on what actually in the end was the better strategy, as he could run the hards without any drop off, whereas the mediums did suffer with that a little bit. But of course, Perez had to stay out on those mediums because they didn't know at the time just how long those hard tyres were going to last. But that does not change the fact that Verstappen was able to charge through the field, overtake cars, and whilst doing this, he was still able to post faster laps than Perez in the opening stages of this race. That race for me hurt any real chance of Perez leading the championship at any point this year. Although with the potential for adverse weather this weekend, anything can happen between these two drivers. They are both great in the wet, just like the two Aston Martin drivers. But if we have learned anything from the past, even the best drivers in the wet can still get it wrong. So with that in mind, what are my early predictions for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix? Well, in qualifying and for pole position, I am going to go back to Old Faithful and say Max Verstappen will score pole position. For the top 5, I'm going to say that in P5, it will be Lewis Hamilton in the Mercedes. P4 will be Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari, provided he doesn't crash in qualifying. P3 will be Sergio Perez. P2 will be Fernando Alonso. And Max Verstappen will win the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. And I also think the race will be a wet race. And the top midfield team will be Alpine. But the question is though, what do you guys think will happen? Let me know in the comments, and as always, comments, leave a like, and subscribe for more F1 content. Thank you all so much for watching.